Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of very wonderful information to share with you today. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Carolyn Corlott. I'm Senior Policy Analyst with Early Edge California, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce our webinar to you, Elevating Assets-Based Virtual Teaching for Dual Language Learners in Transitional Kindergarten, that we are presenting in collaboration with the Center for Equity for English Learners at Loyola Marymount University. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to introduce our presenters and moderator. We are thrilled to have these great teachers join us today. We have Tina Renzulo, transitional kindergarten teacher at Monterey Peninsula Unified School District, and also Maria Lourdes Salazar, also transitional kindergarten teacher from LAUSD, and our moderator, Dr. Elvira Armas, who is Director of Programs and Partnerships for the Center for Equity for English Learners at Loyola Marymount University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in collaboration with Early Edge California and all of our colleagues throughout the state in this broadcast with you today. We have 3 session goals that we've identified for our brief time together. The first is to be able to reflect on design principles for equitable distance learning for dual language learners in transitional kindergarten and similar early childhood settings. Given that transitional kindergarten is an extended opportunity to build a strong foundation for school success, we wanted to be able to explore together what some of our design principles are to be able to attend to dual language learners who represent approximately 60% of the population of learners in early childhood settings in the state of California. We use the term dual language learners, given that this is an asset-based perspective that allows us to look at elevating the assets of these very special learners in all of the diverse communities and spaces that we serve. The second goal is to be able to identify classroom-based strategies to really elevate student and family assets to support social and emotional learning. In order to honor our diversity and to really ensure equity by acting on this diversity, we want to be able to build competent learners, both our learners and the families and adults that support those learners. And so our time today will allow us to explore what this looks like in a distance learning setting. Our third goal is to be able to explore intentional instructional design ideas. The idea of intentionality in teaching is to be able to act on research-based practices and response to the dynamic learners that our families gift us with in our school settings. And so our colleagues today will be able to share specifically the intentionality around developing oral language, as well as attention to integrated ELD. As we proceed to the next slide, we'll be able to share a little bit about our colleagues. You see their voices that you'll hear throughout our time today. This idea of a dynamically evolving time frame as we listen to our colleague, Tina Renzulo, from the Central and Northern California version will help us to together be able to continue to envision the possibilities that exist in the context in which we find ourselves today. But also she's challenging us to think about how when we return to a different state of normality, we might carry these learners with us. Maria Lourdes Salazar brings to us this really important core idea of thinking about early age students and the connection to who we are as educators who support and affect their lives, and the fact that we are a TK family. You've joined us today as TK educators from across the state, or early childhood educators from across the state, to hear from these dynamic leaders. They're educational leaders. They help to broaden and sustain the efforts during this time, as well as during their time in real classroom teaching. They really do embody educational leaders in the sense that they represent experienced and respected teachers They're innovative in their approaches. They're collaborative. They're confident facilitators of learning, both for each other, for colleagues, and for students. They're responsive to contexts of diversity, and they empower families and each other in the communities that they serve. So we're so pleased that they agreed to join us in our session today. As we begin our session, I'd like to share our guiding principles. If we could proceed to the next slide. This is to help our thinking as we have an opportunity to envision our time together around 3 elements. We'll hear about the intentionality of planning instruction in the distance learning space. And with that intentionality, we know that it comes from a research base. For early childhood education, particularly, as we show our next portion of our slide, we have an opportunity to center our thinking around equitable distance learning for English learners. In this case, for our dual language learners, as I stated, we're utilizing that asset-based term through both research that we know, as well as policy that has allowed us to create and innovate in these spaces and in classroom instruction, and that we carry that knowledge with us as we transition to distance learning spaces. So as you see represented on the left, these are all very familiar documents. We anchor currently the opportunity that we have as a state leading the nation in putting forth policy that elevates English learners in our diverse communities. And so you see represented there the California English Learner Roadmap. And within the roadmap, dual language learners are explicitly acknowledged with an insistence on the 4th principle and our obligation to alignment and articulation within across systems, thinking about our systems in early childhood education and the pre-K-12 space as an articulated system. And so that at the heart of what we'll hear our colleagues share is an important part of the intentionality and their transition to these online learning spaces. Our colleagues carry with them and have tabbed the TK implementation guide. You see that listed here. And in that guide, there's an opportunity for us to think about building connections, about comprehensible input, about language development. You'll see this noted as our colleagues talk to us about how they are manifesting different assets of our equitable distance learning design principles. And thirdly is the CDE alignment document. So that guides both goals and outcomes, as well as decisions on a daily basis for being able to best respond to our learners. And we look at then what our colleagues will share in terms of what does this look like in practice in distance learning spaces. So if we could advance to the next section, we'll see a preview of what our colleagues are going to share around intentionality for designing explicit goals and outcomes. You'll hear them talk about focus standards, addressing the digital divide, doing what all of you have been doing, thinking about high-tech and low-tech options. At the heart of this is meaningful connections and engagement, knowing first and foremost that we're taking care of social and emotional needs. You'll hear our colleagues describe their approach to this, as well as bridging family connections in ways in which we may not have even imagined. Maximum comprehensibility is really important as we think particularly about integrated English language development, tapping into prior learning. You'll hear our colleagues talk about their approach to oral language development and leveraging primary language instruction, as well as support. You'll hear also about varied participation structures and differentiation across all of these elements. We're going to transition to the first part of our presentation now, and Tina will lead us in a section around thinking about intentionality and design. I'll pass this along to Tina.
Thank you, Dr. Armas. Well, when the shelter-in-place orders came down, we were on spring break, and my district, Monterey Peninsula Unified, used that time to develop an incredible amount of resources, guidance, training, and vision for distance learning. And among this guidance were key themes of distance learning. The first being that care is more important than content. Simplicity is paramount. Practice flexibility, support one another, and embrace learning through failure. And so you'll hear these being the undergirding of what I talk about today. Also, I have had great influence by the collaboration and the support of my professional community, my administrators, my coaches, especially my TKPLC partners in Monterey, and my school site partner teacher. So my first question I needed to ask myself was, for whom was I designing the distance learning? And immediately I knew it wasn't just my students, it was their parents too. Overnight, parents and guardians became my proxy for teaching my students. I knew that parental access and engagement was going to directly impact my students' access and engagement. So I needed to identify my parents' facility with technology, their preferred modes of communication, and then I began communicating what I tried to make just small digestible amounts so as to support them but not overwhelm. So this was emails, I established office hours, we had group messages, I did Justify videos to step parents through the different platforms we're using. On the next slide, I started thinking about the what. The context balance was shifting from the school building back to home. And I didn't want this to change my practice of intentionally integrating social, emotional, and oral language development throughout all learning, keeping learning experience-based and developmentally appropriate. And that just felt like a really difficult challenge. So the guidance from my district was to deepen and solidify prior content learning. And so I aim to do this within familiar context by bringing the classroom now into the home. So I chose curricular materials that were familiar to my students. They're alphabet cards, puppets, different texts, manipulatives. Our school district supplied bags of supplies for students, and I added some other tools and materials to those bags, and I knew that all my students had picked them up. So I had this nice group of elements that I could teach from, knowing that what I was using my students actually had access to in their homes. And then I started taping video lessons so that my voice and my presence was still relevant to the learning taking place. On the next slide, I talk about when and where learning was going to be happening. This is an example of a week at a glance. And so this is an overview that I send out to families on Fridays, and it gives them hot links to lessons and all of that, but also gives them opportunity to really think about how they want to arrange their week. So if we do the first fly-in, you'll notice that I highlighted just those first 3 columns. And in there, you can see that I put the time frames and then the subject, and then goes into the days of the week. The time frames were so that parents would have a general idea of just about how much time it would take to complete that particular section.
Tina,
I thought
I'm sorry, if I could take a pause for a minute, Tina, I'm wondering if you could just readjust your position. It seems like some of our participants are having difficulty hearing you, and there may be some static. So let's adjust that.
Yep, is that better?
Yes.
Okay,
thank you.
Super. Yeah, thanks for letting me know. So, so in the second column, I listed out what the subject was, but I also thought it would be important to help families know what kind of support children would need in order to work within that particular content area. So for social and emotional skills, or for music, the adult support would need to be logging in, to read, to begin to monitor, and to post responses. But then if we do the next fly-in, you'll see that in that same column, the parent support would be changed. So depending on what the content was, the parent support or the adult support needed would change. Can we go to the next slide? And the why, this was something that I constantly think about. My speaker is not working.
Yes, I'm sorry, Tina. We're still having a little difficulty, and we're okay to readjust.
Challenges.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. As Tina is readjusting, there are a couple of questions that are coming up in the chat about certification for attendance in this training. This is professional learning. There's not a certification associated with it, but certainly an opportunity for you to be able to share this back with your colleagues. Let's give it a try now, Tina.
All right, I think I've switched microphones, and I seem to be getting a green now. So is that better?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So sorry, everyone. So keeping the why central to all of our efforts, to me, this meant all the richness and joy of my classroom needed to continue through the distance learning format. And so that's just what I kept close to my heart through my planning. And next, Lourdes is going to be talking about her experience.
Okay, hello everyone. My experience was similar to Tina's, but and a little bit different because I work for LAUSD and it's such a big district. So I'm going to start by saying that if you teach in LAUSD and you're a TK teacher, you're probably one of the only teachers on your campus with this grade level. So fortunately, I had already established a rapport with several teachers in the city that I work with. And so when distance learning came about, I was able to reach to them to see how we were going to transition from our indoor, in-class, person-to-person teaching into distance learning. So the main thing that we talked about when I collaborated with those teachers was ensuring that we kept the interdisciplinary teaching and the language development, as much of that to continue on into distance teaching. So we decided as a team the first 2 weeks we were going to be connecting with families via telephone to see what they were, how they were going to be able to support us in this distance learning. A lot of our families didn't have technology available, so we wanted to ensure that the children would continue learning, and we wanted to know how best to do that. So we took the first 2 weeks to assess what they had at home, and then we decided that we would continue. In our classroom, we were using the homeroom app to connect to families and be able to continue messaging with them that way. However, not all of the families had connected. We took a few days to kind of get everybody on board. We wanted to ensure that we were connected daily. And so homeroom app became one of the ways we were going to do that. We also learned that packets and assignments was going to be the way that some of the children were going to be learning. And so we decided as a group with in agreement with my paraprofessional that we were going to teach with synchronous modes and asynchronous modes. So we were going to start Zooming for those that had it available. We were going to continue we were going to start doing video recordings for the children via the platform that we were using, which was homeroom. And we wanted to ensure that we continued the routines of the classroom, which was continue morning messages and continue as much as familiar that was to the students when we did, distance teaching. And for that, we also supplied materials for the students that were familiar to them from what we were having in our classrooms, like whiteboards and markers, so that their learning would continue at home. Our district did ask us to do 240 minutes of instruction, and within that, we were supposed to ensure we were using 2 platforms that the district had recommended for the children to use. And for us in TK, we decided 45 minutes a week was going to be what they were going to be expected to do aside from the other stuff. So on this next slide, you will see how after conversations with the parents and the paraprofessionals, I decided that a weekly schedule would work best for my students and my families. I made sure, because I have a lot of dual language learners and a lot of families that are non-English speakers. I wanted to make sure that the assignments were in English and Spanish for them, at least the instructions, and that they were flexible. After the phone calls, I had noticed that I had a lot of working families still, and I wanted to ensure that they didn't feel the pressure of having to complete assignments daily, but by the end of the week. So we decided as a TK family that I would post assignments on Monday morning, and they were to complete assignments by the end of Sunday evening at 6 p.m. Being very flexible with the parents and the students was key in creating the schedule. They didn't have to submit a lot of things online. For my families, I discovered that the best for them was texting. So they would text me pictures of their children, and then I would upload those pictures onto our homeroom platform that we would use. And being supportive to the students' needs and to the family needs was key in developing this schedule, that if they were finding themselves being able to complete something that they would be able to reach out to me at any time. So on the next slide, I think it goes back to Tina.
Yes, actually, I just want to say thank you so much to our two teachers for highlighting this section. Our intent was to be able to underscore the intentionality with which they're designing their instruction. And I know we had a little bit of a blip with the sound, but Tina really shared and highlighted for us that she started at the core with who her students were, as well as considering the context of her families, given that many of her families are service workers and are in the field. Learning for her students was occurring when their families were available, mostly in the evenings and sometimes on Saturdays. And so the schedule that she shared was designed with that in mind. It will be available to all of you as well after the webinar. And what was key when we were working with these talented educators was the intentionality with which there was an opportunity to communicate for families what was a time that they could be involved in and what that involvement would entail, so that the schedules, as Lourdes pointed out, were essentially co-designed with families and with families in mind, as well as with a lens towards developmentally appropriate practice, particularly in TK when it's intended to be a modified K curriculum that's age and developmentally appropriate, responsive to families. We have an opportunity to think about the design principles that we've put forth as a center, and at the core of that, to think about the goals, outcomes, modes of communication, which is what you've heard our two teachers share thus far as part of the intentionality. And I see in the chat that some of you have indicated you have some of these tools available to you, some of these modes of communication available to you. And what was very key in what they shared with us is the intention with which they selected their tools, the familiarity that existed, the accessibility that existed, that is key in addressing the digital divide. And as we transition to hearing from our educators about their attention to social and emotional learning first, we'll continue to uplift how those decisions were made, given that they've had established for themselves and their families larger routines within which they would expect daily and weekly interaction with families and their students. So Tina is going to share a little bit about social emotional learning and her approach.
Thank you, Dr. Armas. So the graphic you're looking at comes from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, also known as CASEL. And this graphic illuminates 5 competencies within social emotional learning. And this is a space that we heavily live in TK. Self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. So as we move into the next slide, social and emotional development are foundational to academic learning. We know this from research, and that's why it's a focal point and a hallmark of the TK year. So a few things that I did to bridge this shift from classroom to distance learning were, I had planned on starting a new unit when we came back from spring break, but I decided to keep with the same thematic study we were working on before the shelter in place, and to watch for indications of new areas of interest that were emerging from the home, because that was the new and physical environment. What were children talking about, what photos were being shared, and what were parents noticing? I also decided to reread some favorite books. Students had deep connections to specific books, so I used these as my initial read aloud videos. As I had said earlier, there were supplies given to students at the TK level from the district, and I added to these with a puppet making kit. I decided to do a unit on puppets because, one, it was a familiar teaching tool in the classroom. It was a bridge to designing a new learning partner, sort of a stand-in for their peers. And it was a continuation of our design focus on criteria and building. Ooh, my speaker seems to be having challenges again. Let's see here. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So creating new points of connection was very important as well. So I decided I needed to show, speaker is having issues. Let's see here. I'm going to try something different. Hopefully that's better. So I wanted to show my home during my lesson videos, being outside, being in the kitchen, sitting at my dining table. I shared photos with students. They shared photos with me and videos in our Google Classroom. When we would have our live meetings, we would share the art and the math and the science projects that we were doing from video. We would bring those then and talk about that learning in our live meetings. And I would just continue to look and listen at every opportunity to highlight what I was seeing and hearing and observing in their pictures and videos, because I wanted to extract from that their cultural experience, watch their learning behaviors, and continue to attend to their building of their self-confidence. In the next slide, I talk about the modeling of the 5 competencies of social emotional learning by relating positivity along with understanding and compassion. I knew that just as in my physical classroom, my emotional expression would influence my students and my parents. So I was constantly mindful of relating positivity and encouragement and a can-do attitude, even though we were coming up against lots of challenges. To bring up opportunities for self-awareness and social awareness, I got a great idea from my same grade level partner, and she was asking daily questions that prompt reflection and response. And I thought that that was a wonderful way to really bring the social emotional into a daily routine with them. So they would post those responses in our Google Classroom. Questions like, what's the funniest thing someone did or said today? What's your favorite thing to do with your friends? And it would get students really thinking and contemplating and then responding. And then of course in our live meetings, the real purpose of the live meetings was to maintain positive and rewarding relationships with all of their classmates. And then in the video lessons, I chose more books with social and emotional storylines. And I also acknowledged our changed environment. I would say things like, we used to do this in our classroom and now we're doing it in your home. Or I know it feels different to learn this way, but I'm excited to see what you post in our Google Classroom. Just trying to give those prompts that would create the social emotional comfort and the awareness, letting them know I was aware of the changes that they were going through and that we were all going to be okay together. And then next will be Lourdes. You're on mute, Lourdes.
And I changed my mic too, so hopefully you guys can hear me. So yes, piggybacking on what Tina talked about, one of the things that I wanted to really focus on with my families was I wanted them to know that the only way to be successful with distance learning was to be able to have the parental support of the families. So we conversated, and I wanted to know, like, who would be with the child during the day when they were they going to be at home with them, or were they going to have them at a sitter's? I wanted to know, when was the student going to complete the work? Was it going to be in the evenings, during the day, on the weekends? And I wanted to know how were the parents going to be able to help their children if they were technology savvy, or if they were going to need help in connecting the children. So I didn't mention earlier, but after 3 weeks of distance learning, all our students in our school were given devices. So they were expected to sign on and complete assignments online. I did mention also about the homeroom app, and homeroom app is just like Dojo. I know someone had a question about that. It's just like it, but it was something that my students were familiar with in the classroom and the families. So I continued it through distance learning. So the message that I wanted the families to have is that we were all in this together, that distance learning was new to them, but it was just as new to us, you know, to me as a teacher and to my paraprofessional, and that we were going to try new things and attempt new ways of learning, new platforms, but if they were not comfortable or if they were not successful, that it was okay for them to let me know, and that we would revamp our learning. I also wanted them, the biggest message I wanted to get across to the parents was that these were still my students until June 12th, and that we were going to continue learning as best as we could, that they were still my responsibility, and that learning was going to continue until the 12th, and that it was my job to do the best I could to continue that, but that I would not be able to do that alone, especially with the age of these children. So on the next slide, I did focus on the social emotional needs of students also, not just on the academic. Within the classroom, I had always believed in setting a growth mindset, but this time it changed a little bit in the sense that it wasn't just developing this growth mindset with the students, but now I also had to take on having this with the parents. I wanted them to embrace this challenge of distance learning, and I wanted them to know that through persistence, we were going to face any setbacks that we had. I wanted the parents to know and the families to feel that I was going to be flexible and responsive to their family needs during this time. When we started, we thought it was going to be 2 weeks, and things were constantly changing, maybe a month, and maybe later, until the end of the school year. So I accepted responses from them. Like I said earlier, I have a lot of parents that are non-English speakers, so their responses to me were in Spanish, and if their children were responding to them in Spanish, we would take those also, letting them know that both languages were accepted. Giving them the flexibility to turn in assignments within 7 days, and then giving them the space when they need it. That was really important during this time. Some of the families lost their jobs. Some of the families were going through difficult times, and I wanted them to focus first on their social and emotional needs at home and what they needed, but still not forget that our academics still had to continue. So sometimes they would ask for a week off, and I would be understanding to that, but then the following week I would make that personal phone call and say, okay, how are you feeling this week? Are you ready to get back on board? So keeping the connection with them. Building self-confidence for both parents and students was very important to me. During the middle of this distance learning, I would say like maybe by the month of April, I had a lot of children having difficulties. They didn't want to connect. They were feeling that they wanted to go back to school. So we were connecting through text messages, through video messages, encouraging them that the way they were feeling, we were feeling too, and that we would get through this together. Also, listening and understanding their needs, not only the student needs, but the family needs, and being able to guide them through when they need it. And working from the assets of the parents and students. Like I mentioned before, some of the parents did not have a lot of knowledge in technology, but guiding them through the process, they started to feel like they could do this and support their children in their learning. And they became very, very inclusive in participating and ensuring that they were sending the assignments in. And not only would I congratulate the children, but the parents too needed to be, said, thank you for taking your time out of a busy day to submit assignments, because some of the text messages I was getting or pictures were, late at night, because this is when the parents had the time to submit assignments. So on the next slide, you will see again, building relationship skills was key in my distance learning process. Like I said, building trust with my families. I can say, like a lot of us, we had already established that relationship because we had known these families from the beginning of the school year, and we had conference with them. But we needed to continue that trust. That I needed them to trust that the assignments that I was setting was something that their children would need, and I needed to trust that, and they needed to trust me that when they would need help, that I would be there for them. The big message was they were not alone. Communication with each other was key. I made myself available to parents throughout the day. They knew that they could text me, message me, or call me if they needed to. And what I had to do was make a list of, so I knew which was the best way to communicate with families. In some cases, parents were working and they were giving the responsibility to the older child to help out. So in that sense, I would talk to the older child, but then later communicate with the parent too. So how the students were doing. So, in this whole distance learning, we got to see a very different part of the family. Like I would meet with parents after school, but now I was communicating with grandparents, sisters, two sides of families that were now sharing responsibility of caring for children. So being flexible to that and communicating with them. One of the key things I wanted to continue was teamwork in our classroom. I made sure that our paraprofessional was participating in our Zoom lessons, that she was uploading videos. I wanted the children to understand that school was still going on, that even though we were at home, school was still happening. So I tried to invite our administrator to some of our Zoom meetings, and she would share activities or share what she was, different things in our class, that she was going through. I invited our computer tech person, so the children were familiar with these people at school, and I wanted to bring as much familiarity to them at home. One of the key things that we used to do in school was sharing time. The children love to share. One of the key factors in TK is oral language development, and I wanted to continue that. And how would we do that? So we continued sharing time through Zoom sessions. At the end of every Zoom session, we would share, they would get to share anything they wanted and from their homes. And that gave them an opportunity to practice listening skills and also honor, you know, their differences and themselves. So on to the next slide.
So as we take just a few minutes to reflect, there are some questions that we've posed here. I want to really underscore and applaud our colleagues for sharing their intentionality, particularly around creating these safe spaces for our diverse communities and being responsive to their different contexts. You heard Lourdes share the co-creation, share the opportunities to create also varied interactions, both by involving adults and children independent and in collaboration with each other, as well as identifying different times of the day for those interactions to occur to accommodate working parents. 40% of Lourdes' students are dual language learners, and she's created a bridge to extended family members and to others who will be able to support, including other children in the household, thinking critically about safety first and responsiveness to who the students are, and thinking strategically about family engagement in a different context, but with the same goals in mind. As Tina shared, the opportunity to really create relationships in a different way via distance, and that insistence on the child's leadership and ownership of those relationships, while simultaneously attending to the diversity, particularly of the multi-generational families that she serves. Has 3 languages represented in her classroom: Spanish, French, and a Polynesian language, and had to really be responsive to the community, also avail herself of the resources that the district provides. And when we think about, again, what undergirds this in terms of design principles for us to embrace and think about, as there are no canned answers for any one of us, you hear our teachers making sense of it in collaboration with each other and in collaboration, most importantly, with the families and communities that they serve. What rises to the surface to be able to really attend to social and emotional needs is this idea of varying participation to really be able to establish family connections and meaningful connections so that learning remains meaningful for students and remains in the ownership of students. I appreciate also seeing the contributions that you all are making as viewers in this webinar. There are great suggestions that you're providing in the chat. If you have an opportunity to drop in 1 or 2 suggestions in response to this reflection, it enriches the opportunity that we all here have today to be able to continue to think about this space and in the future. We're not certain of whether we'll open our new year in a similar space, in a hybrid space, or what space. And so we don't have the answers for what can come in the future, but what we do have is a lot of information that we've been able to gather from colleagues such as those that you're hearing from today to be able to inform from a research base the possibilities that exist. And so we'll transition to the next slide and then our next section, which will focus on how our colleagues attend to oral language development and integrated ELD in support of dual language learners. And when we think about these 2 elements, we think about and embrace the opportunities that exist for language learning. we think about how can we create intentional spaces for conversations to occur. They might occur via Zoom, as you heard Lourdes share. They might occur with the way in which activities are designed and shared with parents to insist on conversations. And with those come engagement in real context. So you'll hear our colleagues describing the context that they envision, imagine, and create, and co-create with their families to be able to encourage active participation, and also to be able to leverage adult mediation or peer mediation, which is part of language learning. You'll also hear our colleagues share how they've transitioned formal instructional spaces that exist in the classroom to develop oral language to a distance learning format. When we think about content learning, we think about integrated ELD in support of our dual language learners, and you'll hear our colleagues address how they're still thinking about an interdisciplinary approach, which is very key in early childhood and in all learning contexts, how they attend to the four language domains: listening, speaking, reading, writing, or drawing for our early learners, as well as that fifth domain or dimension, which is metacognition. And at the heart of that, it's making meaning of the content. So Tina will start us off with a focus on literacy.
All right, so we can move to the next slide. So we know from research that the environment and those in it have significant influences on learning. And in my physical classroom, just like you, I spent a lot of time and effort on the environment to create, establish, and modify conditions supportive of really great learning. And within that development is the bringing in of family and culture of the students. As I attend to the social and cultural practices in the home, I'm always looking for ways to support schema building of my students. I want them to access their individual assets and build and grow them. So now that we were not in the classroom anymore, and we were instead at home, it hit me that this was really an incredible opportunity to deeply link student cultural knowledge and practices to our learning together. And I became a big learner as well. It was a powerful way to support this is to intentionally access the knowledge and the expertise within the home, and this is what we call the funds of knowledge. By seeing and learning more about and referencing the home environment, who lives there, like Dr. Armas said, multi-generational families, the language or languages spoken in the home, their traditions, the daily routines, the cultural practices, their history, and the values that are shared there. All of that are funds of knowledge. And by bringing that and referencing that in my teaching, I'm expressing and integrating the value of home and family as the first teachers. So I use this window into the home to inform and build our thematic learning. In the next slide, I talk about specifically read alouds. You see the guidance from the ELD framework, and we're all familiar with this graphic, and there are identifiable qualities of effective read alouds that are supported by the referencing in the framework. Effective read alouds are interactive. The teacher stops at strategic points to model thinking and to ponder interesting questions and to highlight features of the text or of the plot. That complex texts can be shared when they're rich in content. They can contain general and academic domain-specific vocabulary, and they can have ideas that are worth discussing. Great read alouds also create a positive social emotional climate because they're engaging for both the teacher and the students. And the teacher can do a lot of modeling of vocabulary, grammatical structures, practices of oral discourse, so that the children can be free to focus on the language and the ideas that are presented without getting stuck in all of the meat. So in the next slide, you're going to see a video of me. I apologize for the choppy clips in there, but I wanted to kind of consolidate it down. This is a video lesson I did in my patio on the unit that we grew out of the experiences that we were having was on seeds and plants. Children all seemed to have access to a yard space, and they were very interested in getting out of their homes and into this yard space, and they were making lots of discoveries and observations. So in this video, you'll hear me applying the guidance from the ELD framework as I read a book on seeds and plants. The vocabulary in this text is really complex, but the meaning I tried my best to make accessible by supporting it with the illustrations, with real items, and with descriptions and synonyms. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video. Oh, you can't hear the sound.
It'd be kind of fun to do it
There we go.
outside. So I brought my book, From Seed to Plant by Gail Gibbons, and I'm going to be reading this today. And while I'm reading it, we're going to stop and take a look at some of the things that are growing in my pots behind me and some things that I have on my table for us to look at. And as I'm reading the book, you're probably going to have a lot of connections. You're going to say, hey, I've seen that before, or I wonder if that's what I was thinking about. And that's awesome. I hope that you have lots of connections as we read this book together. So I'm going to get started. From Seed to Plant by Gail. If the pollen grain from a flower lands on the pistil of the same kind of flower, it grows a long tube through the pistil into the ovule, and that's the beginning of the seed. Wow, let's really take a look at this picture. So up here, the pollen grain landed on the pistil, and a long tube grew. You see that white line down there? A long tube grew all the way down here into the ovule and is starting to grow a seed. That's so neat. I wonder if that's what's happening with my plant here. I see all the pollen inside on the pistil, but I wonder if it's been pollinated yet. I wonder if some of the pollen from this flower was put over onto this flower, if that would help to grow some seeds. I could do an experiment on that. The seed grows inside the flower even as the flowers begin to die. As the seed becomes bigger, a fruit or a pod grows around them. The fruit or the pod protects the seeds. Have you seen that on any plants? There's a plant behind me. This one here. I'm going to take off one of these pods that have been growing. Oops, that one dropped. I'll get another one. Take off one of these pods that's been growing. So this was a flower, and it grew down and created this pod. And inside this pod, I'm going to open it up and see if you can see that. Do you see those tiny seeds? Yeah, this is a pepper plant that I've been growing. So the seeds will grow inside of the fruit or the pods like this. Have you seen that in some of your food or some of your plants? Out to my yard with me and reading about seeds and plants. I hope that you had some connections to the things that you saw me show you and the words you heard me reading. And I hope that you go outside and you spend some time in the yard looking for seeds and thinking about how the plants are growing and how maybe they're making their new seeds. And then maybe you can take a picture and put it on our Google Classroom. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you later.
All right, so on the next slide, you heard me in the video using a think aloud stem, I wonder, and that's something I use in my classroom all the time. I just want to give you a few more examples of how I support not just the receptive language, but expressive language skills too. Because oral language development is also foundational to academic learning, it's a second hallmark of the TK year. And so throughout the TK day in the classroom, we're integrating meaning making, language development, expression, content knowledge, and foundational skills in an interdisciplinary manner. Since the majority of my students' learning time was now taking place without me physically there with them, I decided that one way to continue supporting expressive language was to really engage their families around it. I wanted parents to understand the importance of children talking about their learning, what that might look like, and to give them some tips for supporting their children's critical thinking and oral development skills. So I gave them these 6 practices to use: ask open-ended questions, so giving answers other than yes, no, and starting with the W's and the H's, the who, what, when, where, how, and why, and then also throw in I wonder. Also, talk to parents about giving think time a pause that allows children the time to gather their words for a reply, and also leads them to the expectation that there will be a reply. To ask for details, draw out more information from children, to build on what was spoken, so taking a child's words and then maybe adding in a new word or adding in a clarification. And conversing back and forth, the idea of turn taking and keeping on topic and having that discussion go back and forth. And then also expecting complete sentences to express full thoughts, because this is where the richness and fullness of expressive language can be seen. I would continue doing this through modeling it in videos, and I would also write this to parents and embed the questions and prompts into our weekly home learning menu, which is on the next slide. So here you see a portion of our home learning activities menu. This is one 45-minute plus element of our 3-hour learning day. And it's broken up into categories that relate to the learning areas that I had in our physical classroom. So explore, design, create, and imagine. And you see that there's questioning prompts embedded into each of these areas. And I did this intentionally to support families in extending critical thinking and the use of language. So in Explore, you see the prompt is to go find a seed. Well, rather than just finding a seed and having the activity stop there, I gave parents the questions of, how does it feel? What does it look like? What else do you notice? Can you find many other different seeds? And this was really a training for parents for how to really extend and support that oral language development. Other stems might be, what would happen if, what do you notice about, tell me about what you've drawn, made, or constructed. We're very familiar with these in the classroom, and I knew that parents needed that extra support to be able to really utilize that at home. Parents have shared with me their children using the vocabulary of the lessons and talking about their thinking, sometimes prompted and sometimes unprompted, which I think is fantastic. And the next slide, we move into Lourdes. Lourdes, you need to unmute.
Sorry. Okay, continuing with integrated ELD. At our school, we were using cognitive guided instruction in our math program. If you're not familiar with that, it's an approach to teaching mathematics, and the core of the practice is of listening to students' mathematical thinking and using that to base our instruction. So my children were familiar with using this in our classroom, and I wanted to continue this through distance learning. So you will see in these pictures some of the things that we used to do in class that I brought home to do with the students. In the first picture, you'll see subitizing cards. These will help with number sense, understanding quantities, and help with high levels of addition. So we would use these through our Zoom lessons, and I would flash the cards to the students. And then the other 3 pictures were counting collections. We did this in our classroom weekly, twice a week, and the students really enjoyed this. It helped me see how they were developing their one-to-one correspondence and developing multiple forms of representing their collections. So we continued doing this at home with familiar things that they had, and I would tell them, this week count all your spoons and forks, and then send me a picture of how they would show their collections. These are just a few samples of that. On the next slide, you will see a little bit more of cognitive of CGI. We also did What Do You Notice? During this distance learning, we've all had to also take some more learning on. So I took a course through a university online webinar about CGI at home. And what they said was, you could do this from things that you have at home. So we would post the picture, the first one you see on the left with the strawberries, and we would develop oral language and their mathematical thinking on what they saw in this picture. And so it gives them more opportunity to share their thinking skills in math with everyday home ideas. And then problem solving was key to us. We enjoyed having problem solving and doing it as whole group in our classroom. So this was part of our weekly assignments. I would give them a problem of the week, and they would have till the end of the week to show me how they solved it. And problem solving helped build critical thinking skills, and it helped them practice their mathematical strategies that we had been learning in the classroom. And if you go to the next slide, excuse me. This is a little bit, I'll let you guys, well, let me go through the steps of the video and then we'll watch the really short video. So this is a sample of the prompt that I would give them weekly, and these are the steps. Steps 1, 2, and 3 of my think aloud that I would do with my students. So first I would read the problem, and then I would say, what do we know about this problem? What is the question being asked in this problem? And then 4, 5, and 6 would be, what strategy will I use to solve this problem? And how am I going to organize my thinking so others can understand how I'm solving the problem? And most importantly, things that we've talked about that children sometimes tend to forget in the excitement of drawing the picture and solving the problem is, don't forget to answer the question. So what is the response? So you'll see a very short video of how I prompt the students before they solve their problem.
Okay, boys and girls, this is going to be the math problem for the week, okay? Keegan has 6 red buttons. Lindsay has 7 green buttons. How many buttons do they have together? So Keegan has 6. You're going to draw a picture of 6 buttons that are red for Keegan, 6 red. And then Lindsay has 7 that are green. You will draw 7 green ones for Lindsay. And then you have to tell me the answer. How many do they have all together? Okay, waiting for those pictures.
Okay, so one of the things I wanted to mention about this is I always use my students in my classroom as the characters in our prompts. So I had to keep tab of which kids I had already done and which kids I wanted them to feel included. And on the next slide, language development and critical thinking were the key to transitional kindergarten, apart from developing their social and emotional skills. So I wanted to continue practicing CGI through distance learning, to continue developing these critical skills of oral language and critical thinking. These practices, the students were already really comfortable in the classroom doing, and I wanted them to continue them. So this opened the door for parents to learn what CGI was about. And some of the comments was like, now we're learning their way of doing math because that's not the way we used to do it. And so they have said that distance learning has really opened their eyes and understand what really was happening in our classroom, and has them had more engaged in their children's learning. On to the next slide.
And so as we take a pause for reflection, we offer 2 prompts for you. I just want to say that these are our colleagues, as well as you, are definitely examples of innovation and seeking opportunity in a time that we did not expect. And so we're affirming that via our chats. We're also really opening the opportunities for our students to be the dynamic learners that they are. We see the opportunities for them to continue to be creative and inventive in partnership with their families, and with the emphasis on being able to continue to support not only social and emotional learning, but also oral language development with a focus on content. And so we are inspired by our colleagues. We're inspired by you who have been with us. I'd like to transition to the last slide to be able to offer some additional resources. Definitely you'll be able to read our colleagues' full story in our Tale of Two TK Teachers, our Center for Equity for English Learners. Our Executive Director, Dr. Magali Rabadens, is also with us on this webinar, and myself, we're so pleased to be in partnership with all of you. We've been learning so much from teachers all over the state about what efforts are being put forth to ensure that English learners and dual language learners have equitable opportunities in this distance learning space, and as we move forward to a space that we can begin to envision and that we've had an opportunity to really be able to respond to. So we invite you to visit our links. Early Edge California has a lot of incredible resources as well, and we invite you also to engage in other professional learning opportunities with our center. Our center is committed to our continued focus areas: research, practice, in partnering with professional learning alongside you, as well as policy and advocacy. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and most of you have had an opportunity also to be able to give each other feedback. We invite you to send those questions and to continue to engage with us via our email. And I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our fellow educators for being part of this incredible opportunity to be able to share their story statewide. And Carolyn, I'm not sure if there are a few closing words on behalf of Early Edge California.
Yes, thank you so much, Elvira. We just want to say thank you one more time for your great presentation, Tina and Maria. And we also want to let participants know that we'll be sending out the slides, the resources, and as well as the recording of the webinar out to you all via email. And you'll also receive in that email a link to download a certificate of attendance. So we just want to say thank you once again. We're so happy that you were able to join us.